Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from guests all around the world as they share their impactful stories and deliver hope and inspiration through their personal post-traumatic growth. We explore and discuss resources and coping strategies to support the survivor community to thrive in their own healing journeys. Enjoy. All right, so welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I have with me today Geralyn Ritter, and Geralyn is joining us from New Jersey with a great story today. So on May 12th, 2015, Geralyn Ritter was on her way home from an ordinary business trip when the Amtrak 188 derailed outside of Philadelphia. She was crushed in the crash, which killed 8 and injured hundreds. Her abdominal, chest, pelvic, and orthopedic injuries were overwhelming, and she was not expected to live. In a split second, she went from being a globe-trotting senior executive for Merck, one of the largest biopharmaceutical companies in America, to being an immobilized ICU patient on a ventilator, facing a highly uncertain future. For her husband of 25 years and their 3 boys, the hardworking mom turned into someone almost unrecognizable and completely dependent on their care. Geralyn's doctors used the word miraculous to describe her survival and her recovery. Today, she lives a full life inspired by gratitude and offers hope and healing to many others. She wrote her memoir, Bone by Bone, in hopes of helping other survivors of traumatic injury, as well as their families and caregivers. This was inspired by her own feelings of loneliness during her recovery. She has a unique ability to find humor even in the darkest situations and to highlight some of the absurdities of the medical and insurance systems that survivors of complex trauma must navigate and endure. A recognized expert in healthcare policy, Geralyn was determined to restart her career after years of disability leave following the accident. She is now currently an executive VP at Organon & Co., which is a new company dedicated to women's health that launched in 2021. Her husband, Jonathan, and their sons traveled every step of the journey with her, and their experience as unexpected caretakers are very important to her story. She's a frequent public speaker on topics of personal resilience, trauma recovery, the patient perspective on the opioid crisis, and the power of grace. She's made it a priority to give back to the hospital community that saved her life. She's now co-chair of the Patient Family Advisory Committee at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center. She also serves on the board of visitors of the Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy and several other boards of major nonprofit organizations. Geralyn, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad you are still on this earth. I'm glad you are recovered. And I love your story of going from surviving to thriving. So, thriving after this acute sudden trauma, I imagine there were so many moments. What were some of the hardest steps from the day of the accident to where you are now to get yourself here?
Oh goodness. It I would say the hardest element of it was the uncertainty. I feel like if you know where the end point is, if you know what recovery is going to take, if you know it's going to be 6 months of X, one more surgery, and then you're good. But my injuries were so complicated and involved so many different systems in my body that nobody really knew. Would I live without pain at all? Would I be able to walk normally? Would I be able to go back to work? We didn't know. And that was really hard for me, giving up the need to know, to control it.
Mm,
I'm the kind of person I feel like I can get through anything if I just know what I need to do. And
right.
that was tough, giving up that level of recognizing that I couldn't control the timing. I couldn't control, how fast I recovered. I could do everything I was supposed to do, but there was a real element of uncertainty.
Wow. And you were out of work for many years following this. I'm sure many surgeries, a lot of PT. This was years long battle for you to be. This was 2015, correct? So several years after that was just mayhem, it sounds like.
It was really tough. It was really tough. I was on total disability from my job for 2 years and about 4 months, so almost 2.5 years. I then went back pretty slowly,
Mm,
part-time, which is a little bit difficult to do when you're in a senior level executive position. I was a senior vice president at Merck at the time, and I was
mm,
just so fortunate though that my company did support me in
mm,
that journey, did allow me the time I needed to come back gradually and through the ups and downs that followed. So,
mm,
yeah, it did take a while. And, one of the tough things was not just how long it took, but trauma recovery. It's not a straight line journey. It's
yeah.
anything but, two steps forward, three steps back, two steps back, one step forward, and
Yes.
you look back over a couple of years now and I can see the progress,
Mm,
but when you're in it, it's really tough. And I spent a lot of time thinking, why isn't this going faster? And then I'd have another surgery and I'd be back in bed for weeks, back on the pain meds and feeling like, am I really making progress here? So staying positive through those ups and downs is a tough thing to do as well.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, I know you talk a lot about resiliency, right? And resiliency is going to be that thing that keeps you moving forward, even though you feel like you're not going forward, right? What were
Exactly.
some of those, what were some of the ways that you stayed positive, that you dug down and found that resiliency?
I would say the most important thing that kept me going for me was my kids. There were so many days when I was in so much pain. I did go into a pretty deep depression. I was suffering from PTSD, but I had three little boys, and they were young teenagers at the time, 8, 12, and 15 at the time of the accident. And then, 10, 14, 16 as I was recovering. And about 3 o'clock, when all three of them would walk through the door in the afternoon, I would really force myself to kick into gear. I thought, okay, I don't want these kids coming home every afternoon and mom is still in bed, still in her pajamas, still not showered.
Mm,
So it might be 2:59 when I got up. I started, one of the things I started doing once I was able was trying to make sure I was up when they came home. And, that helped me to start seeing little silver linings in my experience. I had always traveled. I'd worked ever since they were born after maternity leaves. I had a job that required a lot of travel around the world, a lot of international travel. And I realized after about 6 months or so, I would get up, maybe not dressed, but I was up. The kids would come home, and then sometimes we'd climb in bed together and watch a movie. And I
mm.
thought, wow, it kind of hit me. I've never watched movies in the afternoon on a weekday with my kids before. And you start to realize there are tiny little elements in this that are a gift.
I'm sure we have other caretakers that are listening right now. What kind of encouragement or advice would you give? Um, I'm thinking about like children who constantly see their parents, in medically compromised situations. A childhood trauma survivor would even be a caretaker if there was alcoholism in the family. They would come home at 3 o'clock from school and maybe find mom or dad passed out on the couch, right? So there's all kinds of this trauma where children and partners become caretakers. Um, how would you speak to caretakers?
I have realized in the years since the accident how difficult it was for my
Mm,
husband and for my children. And I thought that I appreciated it at the time. I
mm,
thought I was very grateful. I thought I expressed that gratitude. I'm a little embarrassed to say I don't think they remember it that way.
Mm,
But I think, recognizing how difficult it is. I think caretakers sometimes feel like, at least from my experience and speaking with the people that took care of me, I realize now how exhausting it was for them. And the not just physically running around, I couldn't drive for well over a year. I had physical therapy every single day. I had multiple medical appointments every single week. I couldn't get out of bed by myself. I couldn't,
mm,
for 6 months or so, I certainly couldn't walk. I couldn't hold anything, carry anything, use the restroom. And that really does place a tremendous burden on a caregiver. And I think the most important advice I would have for the patient is to recognize that. And, for the caregiver too, to recognize that the patient's probably not ungrateful.
mm,
I was so at the end of my wits, I didn't have it in me I didn't have the headspace to be there for my husband. He was angry. Excuse me. We reacted differently. He had a lot of anger. He had a lot of anger about the accident, about the circumstances of the accident, about the train company that caused the accident. And he expresses anxiety and anger by talking about it. And so,
mm,
he would talk about it and he'd talk about it, his anger and his voice. He wasn't mad at me, but his voice would raise. And I was just trying to get through the day. It hurt to breathe. I'd broken all my ribs in multiple places, crushed them. I'm sitting here trying to breathe and to hear him rail we really struggled to be there for each other. And I don't really know what I could have done differently except try to be more empathetic because I was so at the end of my rope myself. And ultimately, we did seek counseling because it was very hard on the relationship.
very
Um,
much, yeah.
looking back, there were times that we both thought our relationship would not survive because we really struggled to give each other what we needed because it was just so hard.
Mhm,
And you've got three boys, right? Their lives don't stop. You want to keep their lives normal. And so, financial worries about me being out of work. Would I ever be able to work again? We weren't
mm,
sure for a long time. So I think when you're in a caregiving situation, recognizing how hard it really is, recognizing that you're not alone,
mm,
and get help. The patient may not be able to provide the help and support you need as a caregiver, no matter how good your relationship is.
right.
I think just like I needed my friends to make me laugh, my husband needed his friends and he needed his own counseling and he needed his own time because I think there's just a limit and to what we were able to give each other in those moments.
Yeah.
Recovery is so different,
Mm,
for different people, but I do think there are some common things that we
mhm,
have that we can do, muscles that we can exercise that help, and that that kind of realism. Like you have to be optimistic, right? You have to be positive. You have to think you're going to get through this, that it is going to get better. But I, for a while, was overly optimistic. I think
mm,
I was in a bit of denial about the seriousness of my injuries. The train derailed going 106 miles an hour on a curve designed for a maximum of 50.
wow.
My my internal organs were all thrown up into my chest. My stomach was above my heart. My colon's in my armpit. My spleen's bleeding uncontrollably. My bladder is ruptured. all my ribs on the left side are crunched into little pieces. My
Wow.
lungs are punctured. My and then my pelvis, that was actually the single technically most dangerous injury. My pelvis was broken in half. The way
Wow.
my brother explained it to me when I first woke up in the hospital, he said, "Sis, the right side's not connected to the left side." And it was crushed on one side. Something had penetrated my hip. So the wound was open. It was dirty. When my husband found me in the hospital, I was a Jane Doe and he had come to try to identify me.
Yeah.
And he didn't know it was me. He couldn't recognize me. I had been in surgery. They had just left my abdomen open, knowing they were going to need to go right back in. I was covered in surgical drapes, casts. I'm in a neck brace because I had broken C7 and L234 vertebra, and they weren't sure whether or not I was going to be paralyzed. And I'm on a ventilator. I couldn't breathe on my own. So,
Mhm.
with the ventilator and the neck brace, and then they had taped my eyes shut because my eyes had been so full of dirt and dust. They were worried
Yes.
about my being able to see. So he
Mhm.
said the only thing I could see was your eyebrows. He said, "Sorry, hon, I didn't recognize your eyebrows." And they were bruised and bloody, and so I was really, really broken. And for a long time, it was hard for me to think clearly as well. And though we were so grateful that I did survive, because
Mhm.
the doctors had initially told my family that it was unlikely, and that they needed to come quickly to say goodbye. And so when I did recover,
Mhm.
it was clear I was going to survive. And ultimately, after a long time, came home from the hospital, came home from the inpatient rehab. Yes, I'm in a wheelchair, but I thought, okay, bones heal in 6 weeks. I'm back home. I'm calling my boss saying, I'll be back to work by the end of the summer. And my mom told me later, she said, every time you would say that to your friends, to your boss, she would leave the room and cry because she knew it wasn't true. But nobody wanted to tell me. And I've since talked to doctors and trauma surgeons about this and said, I think I needed a more realistic appraisal of what was the path ahead of me.
Mhm.
And apparently it's really quite deliberate sometimes. The concern is that if patients know how hard the path ahead is going to be, some will give up. They might not try as hard in rehab. They might not try as hard in physical therapy because it just seems so overwhelming.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure what the right answer is, but for me, I think a more realistic appraisal of what was ahead of me, how bad the pain was going to be, how
Mhm.
long it might be before I even walked, much less was pain-free,
Right.
probably would have helped because as the months wore on and I'll be back in work at 6 weeks and then another 6 weeks, or I just need one more little procedure and then I'll be back at the end of the year. I kept feeling like I was failing. I kept
Uh,
feeling like, I had set these unrealistic expectations for when this was all going to be better. And then they would come and go, and I'd set another goal and I would miss that. And I
mhm.
think that really contributed to the depths of my depression because that doubt, am I ever going to get better? Or and then maybe I'm just not trying hard enough. Am I just laying in bed wallowing here?
Mhm.
That was very tough. And I read once this really great story about the balance between optimism and realism. And it's by it quotes Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war, a real hero in Vietnam.
Mhm.
And he was asked, how did you survive for so long in the POW camp? How did you survive that? And he said, I never doubted that I was going to make it out. And this was going to be the defining event of my life. I never doubted. I knew it. And he was asked by the interviewer, well, who didn't make it? Who just, couldn't stand that? And he said, "Oh, that's easy. The optimists." He said
Mm.
they were the ones that said, "We'll be out by Christmas," and
Yeah.
Christmas would come and go. "We'll be out by Easter," and Easter would come and go. "We'll be out by the summer." He said, and they died of a broken heart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that is so powerful. When I read that, I just instantly identified with me saying, "I'll be back to work in 6 weeks." Well, another 6 weeks. Well, and,
Yeah.
yeah, you have to be optimistic. You have to be positive. The pain will get better. You will recover, but you're not in charge of the timetable. And you
Mm.
may not do it on your schedule. And there is an acceptance of that reality that was really important for me. And I think ultimately paved the way for my emotional healing, if not the physical. I'd gone for some follow-up appointments at the hospital. I'd recently gotten out of the rehab hospital, and I'm in my wheelchair. I had, because so many things were wrong with me, I had back to back to back to back. Okay, you're going to see the pulmonologist and then the orthopedist and then the urologist and then the vascular surgeon. Da, da, da. By the end of the day, I'm exhausted. I'm sitting there in my wheelchair, and I was meeting with the trauma team. And I just will always remember my wonderful trauma surgeon looked at me and said, "So, how are you doing?"
Mm.
And I immediately started lapsing into, well, my ribs are this, my hip is this, my digestion. And she said, "No, no, 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 no. How are
Mm.
you doing?"
Yeah.
And I looked at her and I didn't know the answer. And I just
Mm.
started crying. I had started thinking of myself as this collection. I had so many specialists. I had 11 different specialists for every different body part and system.
Yeah.
I was thinking of myself as this kind of collection of broken things. And when she said, "No, no, how are you doing?" I just lost it. I just started crying.
Yeah.
I didn't know. And she said, Geraldine, I recommend that all my trauma patients get counseling for
Mm.
PTSD. And I kind of snapped, like, I was like, and I started arguing with her. Because it didn't apply to me. I was quite sure. It
Mhm.
was, I
Absolutely.
said, "Look, I'm not a combat veteran. Nobody
Mm.
tried to hurt me. I'm not a victim of domestic violence or random violence. This was an accident. I'm a smart person and I'm rational and I know that accidents happen. And my body is broken, but I'm fine."
Mm.
And, I'm sitting there telling her all this, and she's just kind of looking at me. And she said, "Well," she sort of repeated, "I recommend that all my patients." And she said, she said, "Do me a favor, just keep it in mind." And it took another month or two, and the depression really set in. The pain was so bad.
Mm.
Pain does something to you.
Yeah.
Pain really, really does something to you when it acute pain certainly, but chronic pain,
Mhm.
serious chronic pain. And I finally did take her advice and got counseling for PTSD. And I started reading once I could focus on the books. And I learned how much, our physical and our emotional health, there's a biochemical reason for this. Why, overwhelming brokenness in your body sets your nervous system on high alert and changes your brain chemistry and does produce depression and the symptoms we know of PTSD. And once I understood that,
Mm.
I kind of allowed myself to acknowledge that and not see it as a weakness, but just
Mm.
as one more thing that I needed to get over, that needed to heal, but I needed to understand it in a different way.
Mm.
And I needed, I felt guilty. I felt like I didn't deserve to grieve, to
Mm.
be depressed. I lived. 8 people died in that accident, and a lot of them were sitting right around me in the first car of that train.
Mm.
And what right did I have to cry? Yes, I was in pain, but I was here. I was recovering with my family. I had good insurance. I had loving people around me. I didn't feel like I had a right to be
Mm.
sad
Mm.
and or a right to experience PTSD. And that was a real learning for me as well.
You said that you speak a lot, engagements about the patient's perspective on the opioid crisis. And
Hmm.
I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that before we wrap down here.
Sure. It is hard to be on those drugs. My experience is very different than what you read in the newspapers, and I acknowledge and my heart breaks for the folks that have been affected, the families that have lost loved ones, either to the depths of addiction or to actual overdoses. The crisis is real, so nothing I'm saying should be interpreted as doubting any of that. And it is awful, and we do need stronger policy measures to deal with it. But there is a perspective of a pain patient that I feel like has gets lost in the headlines and gets lost a lot of times in these sort of sweeping edicts that, doctors can only prescribe a certain amount.
Yeah,
Well, patients aren't one size fits all. I
right.
was literally hit by a train. I was crushed. I'd like to
Yes.
think if there's a legit pain patient out there, surely I fit that mode along with many others who suffer. If I didn't have my husband, and others helping to take care of me, keeping my meds filled, running to the pharmacy, reminding me when to take them, handing them to me in the middle of the night when I hurt too much, even to reach over to the bedside table beside me, I would never have been able to take them as prescribed.
Mm,
And I seriously think I would not have made it. My desire to live would not have been there without them because I was in so much pain all the time. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to move. And the only thing that kept me going and able to talk to my children, to think about recovery, to think about anything else than pain
yeah,
was the medications. And I was on a ton. I
for
was on
sure.
very high doses of fentanyl, high doses of Oxycontin, oxycodone, as well as non-narcotics like Lyrica and Cymbalta and others. I had so many different types and sources of pain. And each of those drugs had a different schedule, right? The fentanyl was a patch every 3 days. The OxyContin was 3 times a day. The oxycodone was breakthrough pain, usually in the morning, and then some were before lunch, some were after a meal. Some I would need to take in the middle of the night. But the thing is, you can't, because they are trying to prevent addiction, you can only get a 30-day supply. Well, the 30-day supply runs out at different times, and the doctors won't give you a prescription for a refill. At the time, it was only in person. You had to go to the office, pick up a physical paper copy, on day 28, if you're lucky, 29 often. So then you've got, 48 hours at most to get that filled. So my husband would pick up the piece of paper, run. Sometimes depending on the doctor, I'd have to show up in the car, crutch to the front desk, show them my ID, get the prescription. We'd take off for the pharmacy. And then the pharmacy would say, okay, but this is an opioid. It needs prior approval by your insurance. And I'd say, I've been on it for months. Nope, everything's, and by the way, the insurance company wants 48 hours to approve it. It's like, well, I don't have 48 hours before I run out. At this point, the pharmacist is looking at you like, oh, you addict. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
no, I need it. I need it now. I can't wait 48 hours. And so at that point, I'd get on the phone with my insurance and they would, say, look, you guys, and they would try to speed it up and, maybe it would only take 24 hours. And then the pharmacy would say, well, we don't have that. We're out of stock. Or it's too close to the end of the month. We're only allowed a certain allotment and we're out. We won't have any until next month. And I'd say, well, what am I supposed to do? And they'd say, well, you could try the pharmacy across the street. And so we would go, you know, and I'm sure I
Does
was,
it start all over with the insurance at a new
yeah,
pharmacy?
no, not necessarily. I mean, they could
Okay.
call it over, but then we would be driving around town trying to find the pharmacy, that had the OxyContin 40 milligrams or 30 milligrams. And, or maybe I was down to 20. And, there were times when I would start going into withdrawal. The nausea, the shaking, because we just couldn't find a pharmacy that would fill it on time. And that would be, you're on 6 different painkillers, every single one. And there's a shame, there's a stigma attached to it. And even when I started weaning, then I was on a different dose. Oh, wait a minute, a different dose. Well, yes, it's lower. Oh, well, that's a different thing. We need a different approval. You've changed dose. I thought, this is crazy. And the worst part was, and I think a lot of insurance companies do this, I had to take drug tests every month, pee in a cup, to prove that the drugs were in my system and prove I wasn't selling them. And I thought, oh, good grief. Trust me, I am not selling them. I need these drugs to breathe, to get through the day. And, but once a month I'd need to show up and submit a urine sample and prove that I was actually taking the medicine. It was really, really tough. So when I hear these stories of somebody going to the doctor for a sprained ankle and getting, a 3-month supply of OxyContin, after a root canal, I just can't identify. I mean, for me, my experience was very hard to get, very hard to stay on them as directed, and, even when you really need them. So for me, I just think there has to be room for nuance, for physicians that really know their patient. And the CDC has recognized that as well. They recently, just last year, put out new guidelines giving doctors more flexibility for medical judgment because there's been too many tragic cases of pain patients who were very well controlled on their meds, unfortunately committing suicide because the doctor said, I'm not allowed to prescribe these for you anymore. And the patients couldn't live with the pain. And there have been so many reports that actually the official guidelines now are giving doctors more flexibility and saying, no, you don't take a well-controlled patient and just throw them off like that. You know, there's other things you can do, different meds, gradually reduce it. Or some people just have conditions where they do need to be on pain medication on a regular basis. Not nearly as many, of course, as have been prescribed it by, you know, uh, dishonest, frankly, physicians, but we can't lump all of the doctors in that category.
Before we let you go, in your personal journey, we just always like to ask all of our guests, what was the most impactful resource for you through your healing journey?
Laughter.
Mm,
Honestly, laughter. There were so many things I tried, things I did, but my friends, my family coming over, and even in the depths of pain, of fear, we found things to laugh about. And that little glimpse of normality, that ability to smile, you felt like you're still in there somewhere. The real me is still there. And people don't need to treat me with kid gloves, right? They can joke with me, they can laugh. And that was super healing. So I think sometimes when we're grieving, we almost have to give ourselves permission to laugh. It's okay. I could make fun of myself. I called it the granny potty, that I had because I had to, all of the medical equipment that I needed. We laughed about it. We made, my kids made fun of me. It was okay.
Thank you, Geralyn, so much for sharing your story. It has been lovely getting to know you. You have your book, Bone by Bone. Tell us where to find your book. Tell us where to find you if people want to reach out. Tell us about your socials and how can we get in touch with you?
There is a website, bonebybonebook.com. You can order it directly. It's also on Amazon and all of the major sites. I have an author site, GeralynRitter.com, with more about the accident, and I've included a lot of resources. One of the things I tried to do once I could is learn about trauma, understand why I felt like what I did.
Yeah.
And it really helped me feel less alone.
Mm.
I would read the stories of other trauma survivors and say, oh, they went through that too. I'm not crazy. So I've got a number of books on trauma survivorship. So I urge you to check that out or follow me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I am on all of the social media channels.
I really appreciate you being on today, and I'll have all of this and more, how people can get in touch with you, everything all linked up in the notes. Thank you
Super.
so much.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for what you're doing to
Mm,
support so many trauma survivors, especially when they need it most.
thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening or watching this episode of Trauma Survivorhood. For more info, show notes, and links, check out the episode guide below. Until next time, be well, survivors.